London, 1788. The first city of the British Empire. The city bards immortalize in verse and song, such as this 1738 poem by Samuel Johnson.
Here malice, rapine, accident conspire, and now a rabble rages, now a fire. Their ambush here relentless ruffians lay, and here the fell attorney prowls for prey. Here falling houses thunder on your head, and here a female atheist talks you dead.
In the summer of 1788, when Jane was 13, she visited the site of depravity and female atheism. There, her family stayed with the family of Mr. Austen's older half-brother, the Walters. Jane's cousin Philly wrote in a letter to their mutual cousin, Eliza.
The youngest is very like her brother Henry, not at all pretty and very prim. But it is hasty judgment which you will scold me for. Jane is whimsical and affected.
People who remember Jane often remember a woman of extremities, both silly and serious, both affected and reserved, both sociable and introverted. And at first glance, it can seem contradictory. We can say a few things with certainty. Jane Austen had a marvelous imagination. She certainly could be very polite, but both her absurdity and her reserve had the potential to put off certain people at first glance. But there were those who saw something in her, an imagination, a cleverness, a genius even. So much so that at a young age, these qualities endeared her to them almost immediately. As Jane entered adolescence, we begin to see the first inklings of the genius that would become her trademark. These formative years are filled with arts of every stripe and variety. She develops her taste not just for books, but for music and theater as well, and we see the relationships begin to form that would shape her for the rest of her life. In this episode, we're taking you from age 13 to 17 to give you an idea of the Jane that would soon emerge. We'll dive back into her teenage writings, learn about her love of music and theater, and uncover more of the culture that inspired her. It's a lot of ground to cover, so let's open up our books. This is Finding Jane Austen, Episode 5, A Partial, Prejudiced, and Ignorant Historian. I'm your host, Dr. Anne Ferdig. 1788 was an exciting year to be in London of all places. Earlier that year, two English abolitionists, Thomas Clarkson and William Wilberforce, incited the Prime Minister to conduct an official investigation into the slave trade, a significant milestone in the eventual abolition of slavery in Great Britain. 1788 was also the year of the First Regency crisis. In that year, George III experienced his first bout of what was called at the time madness. The Prince of Wales and his supporters lobbied for the unpopular prince to become regent and invested with the full powers of the monarchy, which terrified the likes of the Prime Minister and those who saw the prince as an irresponsible spendthrift. But George III recovered, and the regency would not begin for many years. London was also a violent place. Earlier in 1788, a criminal called by the epithet the London Monster had begun assaulting women with a knife, beginning a crime spree that would end in 1790 with the arrest of a man named Renwick Williams. Such lurid details may have fascinated young Jane, who, as we know, had a youthful fascination with crimes and criminals. Perhaps for this reason, some scholars believe that her journey to London inspired her story, The Beautiful Cassandra, which in 12 vignettes tells the story of a beautiful young woman who steals, harasses, and menaces her city throughout the course of a single day. Here's Dr. Misty Kruger, who you heard in the last episode.
Austen was obsessed with criminals as a teenager. I'm using that term criminal to mean someone who defies the law, but also defies social laws, social norms, around body type, around class, around manners, religion, morals, all kinds of things. Some of these characters, they're just bad and we don't know why. That makes them scarier. Because if a character says, I'm doing this because, you can go, oh, okay. But if they just murder and we don't know why, right, that makes them like a boogeyman and we'd never see them coming. How did she get access to these monsters? That is a question I have thought about many times. And of course, a lot of it comes from the literature that she was reading, that she had read. But I have to believe that she probably heard a lot from her older brothers, from perhaps her parents. I don't know if maybe there were news stories that had gotten all the way to Steventon. Somehow I feel like maybe the rumor mill, because she, in her letters, you can definitely tell she was a great gossip. She loved to gossip. So if you like to gossip, I kind of feel like you probably also enjoy listening to gossip. So that's just, my speculation. But yeah, I think it would just be literature or things that she had heard in the home or at church or who knows where.
An interest in criminals and violence may not have been the late 18th century ideal for young girls, but even back then, true crime entertained a large female audience. And even in her educated, respectable household, Jane had access to gossip and news from all over the country. Recall the dining table of Madame Latournelle, whose tea often came with a side of, well, tea. And along with crime and criminals, there's evidence that Jane was absorbing all manner of contemporary tabloid gossip. Here's Dr. Janine Barkas, Chancellor's Council Centennial Professor in the Book Arts at University of Texas at Austin.
I wrote a book called Matters of Fact in Jane Austen about her use of celebrity culture and about location and history. I believe that she plucked almost all her protagonists' surnames from history books and newspapers, using a kind of reader's association with blingy celebrity names to her advantage. I think that ironically, Austen's own celebrity has erased these associations because obviously today when you Google some name like Dashwood, it's bound to yield hits only for her novel Sense and Sensibility and not for this infamous family that had that last name in her day that were in the newspapers then. So if you want an example from her own biography, at age 10, Jane Austen wrote in her father's parish registry, as a kid does in her father's books. She filled in the blanks of a form at the back for the saying of so-called marriage bans. And in doing so, she creates a kind of mock entry for a marriage between Jane Austen of Steventon and an imaginary Henry Frederick Howard Fitzwilliam of London. And in another fantasy entry on the same page, Jane Austen again marries a plain Jack Smith. So that juxtaposition between names that ring celebrity bells and the sort of glam of a Fitzwilliam or a Wentworth or a Dashwood, that bling is the fame of the Kennedy name for me or the Kardashian name for my students. And that juxtaposition between a Jane Austen of Steventon who marries a plain Jack Smith or who marries a Fitzwilliam, that's, even at age 10, her preoccupation. And the celebrity that some of these names ring is infamy. It's not all wholesome. And that her, Jane Austen's own, often very wholesome characters have replaced that infamy for us.
Jane's references to Georgian pop culture can be a blink and you'll miss it detail in some of her novels. The type of topical association that you easily gloss over if you don't spend a lot of time in Georgian archives. But it goes to show that even in rural, insular Hampshire, Jane was exposed to a broad and vibrant popular culture. And she was fed that culture through a steady diet of books, magazines, newspapers, social networks, and theater. Now, it probably won't surprise you to hear that the theater scene in Steventon, England was not exactly vibrant. But the indie scene was fabulous. If by indie you mean the Austen children, and by scene you mean their barn. Whether it was from printed versions of popular plays or from the influence of older, fashionable relatives like Cousin Eliza, even the youngest Austens knew of the more popular plays hitting the London markets. The Austen children had put on Christmas plays every year or two since Jane had been about 6 years old, but she'd been too young at that point to take much of a role in any of them. But it was with the arrival of Cousin Eliza in 1786 the plays began to ramp up. Eliza helped the Austens transform their barn into a makeshift stage, and it is believed that Jane began acting in these plays around the same time. In 1787, when Jane was turning 12, the family performed a play called The Wonder, written by female playwright Susanna Centlivre. Set in Lisbon, The Wonder tells the story of two female friends, Violanta and Isabella. Isabella's father threatens to marry her off to an old man, so Violanta hides her best friend to prevent the marriage. Now, Violanta is in love with Isabella's brother, who becomes intensely jealous when he begins to notice a handsome British man at her home. Little does he know, but that British man is the lover of his hidden sister, not of Violanta. The wonder, mentioned in the title, refers to the fact that it is a wonder that, quote, a woman kept a secret. Yeah, thanks for that one, Susanna. Just a month later, in January 1788, the Austens put on another play, this time The Chances by James Fletcher. The Chances was no less exciting. It featured a foundling baby, confused identities, and a little bit of supposed magic. 2 months later, in March, the Austens performed another play. This one was the classic Tom Thumb. Tom Thumb, of course, tells the tale of the folk hero of the same name, who is no larger than a thumb. Henry Fielding wrote the play in 1730. If that name sounds familiar, Fielding was also the author of Tom Jones, a novel we discussed in the last episode. Tom Thumb is less salacious than Tom Jones, if a bit more farcical. At one point, Tom is swallowed by a cow, becomes a ghost, and then is murdered. Again. Sounds like something a teenage Jane Austen would write, no? By June, Henry had gone to Oxford, and there were no plays at Steventon until Christmas. It is likely, however, that in the Austen's theater's off-season, a young, up-and-coming playwright decided to begin pre-production on a new, original story, never before performed, not even in London. Yes, little Jane wrote her first play, The Mystery. The titular mystery of the play is the question, what is the mystery? It features a series of characters who never tell the audience the secret. Instead, they insinuate it through half-completed sentences and whispers that there is a secret and they all know it, even if you, the audience, do not.
I'm very sorry to hear it.
Then 'twas to no purpose that I...
None upon earth. And what is to become of... Oh, that's all settled.
Whisper, 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 whisper. And how is it determined?
I'll tell you.
Whisper, 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 whisper.
And he is to... I'll tell you all I know of the matter.
Whisper, 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 whisper. Well, now I know everything about it, I'll go away.
Once again, Jane is turning tropes on their head. These juvenile jokes, however, are evidence of a young mind experimenting with form and convention. We often think of Jane as a novelist, but especially when she was young, she experimented with a broad range of mediums. For example, we might not think of Jane as a poet, but poems and songs intersperse the prose in her works. She composed songs for both Frederick and Elfrida, as well as Henry and Eliza, two of her earliest works. These songs appear to imitate rustic and romantic themes popular in this period. And it makes sense that just as Jane is developing her literary voice, she was also developing her musical one. It is suspected that she had her first music lessons when sent to live with Anne Colley. Let's hear from Dr. Gillian Dooley, Honorary Associate Professor in English Literature at Flinders University, and author of She Played and Sang, Jane Austen and Music.
A lot of these things we can only guess about, really. We've got these little scraps of evidence which tend to get blown up into, solid fact, that her teacher was George William Chart, the assistant organist and later organist at Winchester Cathedral. Now, the only reason we think that is that she mentions him in a letter to Cassandra. She would have had some musical tuition from Anne Corley in Oxford in a very tumultuous year when she and Cassandra, with Jane Cooper as well, of course, and was schooled by Mrs. Corley, because there are music books that belonged to Anne Corley, which came into Jane Austen's music collection or into the Austen family music collection somehow, and it seems most likely that they came through Jane.
2 music books from Mrs. Corley survive. A collection of both what we consider classical repertoire like Handel's Andante, religious music, and more popular colloquial songs. When Jane went to Reading Abbey School, it is likely that she received further education in the pianoforte. What we do know for certain is that when Jane returned home from Reading Abbey School in 1786, we have a record of Mrs. Austen renting a pianoforte. Later, the family would buy a pianoforte, and this was Jane's pianoforte. Her love of the instrument followed her throughout her life. But first things first, what in the world is a pianoforte?
The piano, or the pianoforte, was developed during that time and became the most popular instrument, particularly for women to play. The second half of the 18th century is very much the era of transition from the harpsichord to the piano.
We know that Jane Austen enjoyed and played music. As Dr. Dooley tells us, it can be hard to piece together exactly where that love of music first began. But it is clear that this love began as a child and followed Jane throughout her life.
Once again, we can just go on what's in her letters. Some of them say, I was glad to get out of the reach of the sound of the music at a concert. And another time she would say, I was listening to Miss such and such play the piano and she really, really enjoyed it. Her fingers were most fluidly harmonious. It seems to me that she was a discerning music lover.
Just like with the theater, however, young Jane was not often in spaces where the latest music trends were being developed. Instead, she discovered new music through her social networks, as most people would during this time. Remember, there's no recorded music, no radio stations or streaming services to discover more music. You discovered music by hearing it. You might hear a song at someone's home, for example, and ask to copy it. Or visit a theater where the actors sing a song so devastatingly tragic, you buy the printed sheet music and paste or bind it into your music book by hand. In the Austen family, 18 albums with over 500 individual songs exist. All of these songs were copied or collected by a member of the Austen family. 4 of the albums, with roughly 160 songs, belong to Jane, although she also likely borrowed music from her family. It appears as though she kept one book for pianoforte songs and one for vocal songs. The family's music books are a snapshot of the musical tastes of the period. There's a book of lessons, for example, that Cassandra owned that demonstrates a musical education that might seem startlingly familiar today, complete with chords and fingerings. There's also a manuscript book titled French Songs that dates to roughly the period that Eliza visited Steventon. Eliza may have given Jane her very first music book, a blank manuscript that Jane would later fill in. In it, we can see that the first and third pieces copied into the book had both originated in a copy of French overtures that Eliza herself owned, and which still exists to this day. If you want to see the Austen family music books for yourself, they're all available online and for free through the Internet Archive. Definitely take the time to check it out.
Want $1,000 weight loss medication for $50? It all starts with Rose's free GLP-1 insurance check. Just upload your insurance card to see if you have coverage, then relax. Over 200,000 people have qualified for a $50 copay through Ro. Go to ro.co/health. Half of covered patients have a $50 per month copay or less for medication, plus $145 monthly Ro membership fee. Deductible cost may apply and final cost varies by insurance plan. For safety information about GLP-1 medications, including boxed warning, go to ro.co/safety, RX only.
If there's one thing that should be clear by now, it's that Jane was prolific. She was writing constantly. In 1790, when she was about to turn 15, Jane was given the gift of a new manuscript book by her father. This book would become volume the second of her teenage writings. This gift is a lovely reminder of the ways in which her family showed an early support of her writing talent. The gift of a blank manuscript book was meant to encourage young Jane to continue writing. And from what evidence we have, Jane's family loved her writing. She would sometimes read her stories out loud to her family. Many of the stories were dedicated to her friends and family. Henry and Eliza was dedicated to her cousin Jane Cooper, Frederick and Elfrida to her friend Martha Lloyd, and the mysteries she dedicated to her father. Volume the second marked a new era in Jane's writing. Her playful wit and parodic voice remained in some areas, but the pieces grew longer, more contained, more coherent, and more stylistically mature. There were 3 significant pieces of Jane's early writing in this volume: Love and Friendship, Leslie Castle, and Jane's infamous History of England. Each would probably warrant an episode in and of themselves, but for the purposes of brevity, and my producer's sanity, I will keep it contained to a brief summation. If Love and Friendship sounds familiar, it is because it is the title of a recent movie adaptation starring Kate Beckinsale. But don't be fooled. While the film was an adaptation of an early Jane Austen work, the plot was actually an adaptation of Lady Susan, a much later draft of an epistolary novel that scholars typically see as the transition from Jane's teenage writings to her adult writings. Love and Friendship was simply taken as the title. Love and Friendship is written in the form of an epistolary novel, so again, written as a series of letters, as was fairly common for novels of the period. And I feel obliged to inform you listeners that the friend in friendship is spelled Friend, for no other reason than it gives the piece's title its characteristic charm. Written likely when she was 14, the story is at first glance already a remarkable development from what came before it. Rather than the short chapters of her earlier writings, each letter of Love and Friendship feels like a fully developed chapter, and there's a plot that does come to some resolution, but like the previous works, it is full of naughty behavior, theft and runaway marriages and disobedience. The story is written as a series of letters by Laura to the daughter of a friend, recounting the adventures of her life. Laura was born in a simple country vale and never knew the pleasures of, quote, the dissipations of London, the luxuries of Bath, or the stinking fish of Southampton. Laura runs off to marry Edward, the wealthy son of a cruel baronet, who wishes Edward to marry someone else. They meet up with Augustus and Sophia, who had also eloped. Augustus has stolen some money from his father and then was arrested for his debts. Edward disappears trying to find him, and that leaves Laura and Sophia on their own. Laura and Sophia, filled with sensibility and great feeling, go on a series of adventures. They meet a man who turns out to be both of their grandfather. They faint often, sometimes on the sofa, and other times into each other's arms. In the most famous scene, the women witness a carriage accident.
2 gentlemen, most elegantly attired but weltering in their blood, was what first struck our eyes. We approached. They were Edward and Augustus. Yes, dearest Marianne, they were our husbands. Sophia shrieked and fainted on the ground. I screamed and instantly ran mad. We remained thus mutually deprived of our senses some minutes, and on regaining them were deprived of them again. For another and a quarter did we continue in this unfortunate situation, Sophia fainting every moment and I running mad as often.
Edward dies, but don't worry. His dad ends up offering Laura £400 a year. Sophia also dies, but with a moral warning about the dangers of fainting too much. The story was written for the enjoyment of her family and dedicated to her cousin Eliza. Leslie Castle, which she wrote when she was 16, is an incomplete epistolary novel about the dramatic and at times catty drama for Margaret Leslie, who is holed up in a castle in Scotland, to her friend Charlotte. Charlotte has her own issues. She spent so much time cooking and preparing for her sister's wedding, only for the groom to go off and die. As Charlotte laments,
Good God! You don't say so. Why, what in the name of heaven will become of all the victuals? We will never be able to eat it while it is good.
Leslie Castle is unfinished and doesn't have as neat a narrative arc as Love and Friendship. But in parodying the shallow nature of the two women, it marked Jane's move towards a more grounded style. Relatively speaking, of course. Some of the more absurd humor of her early youth is starting to develop into a more mature style here. And while the humor and burlesque is still a core part of the novel, you start seeing the inklings of a more complex critique of society. But Jane was interested in more than novels in this period. Not only was she starting to think through the superficiality of social conventions, as we see in Leslie Castle, but also in the ways the wider world worked. And nowhere is this more apparent than in her early critiques of history. Now, I'm going to take a step back a year here and finish with a work that is not only my favorite of Austen's teenage writings, but also beloved by many. It is one of her best-known teenage works, one of her most accessible, and one of her most ambitious.
The History of England, from the reign of Henry IV to the death of Charles I, by a partial, prejudiced, and ignorant historian. Nota bene, there will be very few dates in this history.
I'm not alone in loving this text. Here's Dr. Misty Kruger again.
My favorite is The History of England. And I've always been a history buff, so it was really fun to come to a text that I thought, well, I know what's going to happen because I know history. But then I read this and I thought, this is not history, this is something else. So The History of England is a mock history. It's like a mockery of the whole grand idea of what history is.
Jane provides short biographies of the monarchs.
Henry IV ascended the throne of England much to his own satisfaction in the year 1399, after having prevailed on his cousin and predecessor, Richard II, to resign it to him and to retire for the rest of his life to Pomfret Castle, where he happened to be murdered. Edward IV. This monarch was famous for his beauty and courage, of which the picture we have here given of him and his undaunted behaviour in marrying one woman while he was engaged to another are sufficient proofs. Richard III. The character of this prince has been in general very severely treated by historians, but, as he was a York, I am rather inclined to suppose him a very respectable man.
If you're a fan of the Tudors, be warned. Jane Austen was not. She called Henry VII as great a villain as ever lived. She lambasts Henry VIII for destroying the monasteries of England, and she believed all of his wives to be innocent. Yeah, including Anne Boleyn. But it is Queen Elizabeth I who drew her greatest ire.
It was the particular misfortune of this woman to have bad ministers, since, wicked as she herself was, she could not have committed such extensive mischief had not these vile and abandoned men convicted at and encouraged her in her crimes.
The greatest crime, according to young Jane, was that Elizabeth executed Mary Queen of Scots. If you're not familiar with this period in British history, Elizabeth and Mary were rival queens. Elizabeth the Queen of England and Mary the Queen of Scotland. If Elizabeth was to die without an heir, as she was expected to do, Mary would inherit the crown of England. But there was one problem. Mary was a Catholic, deeply unpopular in the Protestant countries of England and Scotland. There's a lot more to the story. Eventually, Mary was imprisoned by Elizabeth and later executed. Supposedly, letters were found in her hand encouraging a rebellion against Elizabeth. But even to this day, some people think that the letters were forged to provide Elizabeth with a convenient excuse to execute her biggest threat. But while Queen Elizabeth has generally been beloved in history, in the 18th century there was a reaction against her. And we can see young Jane Austen processing and engaging with this historical debate at the young age of 15 by asserting that Mary was innocent. In the accompanying watercolor portraits that Cassandra made of the monarchs, there was a gaudy image of Elizabeth with an exaggerated chin and nose, contrasted against a maiden-like Mary. But this is not just a passing reference for Jane. It is actually part of a consistent pattern that emerges in 1791. Jane becomes very interested in history, and she forms some staunch opinions, such as this one, informed perhaps by the historians that she is reading, which may include female historians as well as male. We know this not just because of what she wrote in her own history of England, but because of the notes she wrote in copies of histories written by other historians. You see, Jane's brother James had a full set of the 4 volumes of the History of England by Oliver Goldsmith.
What's really great is that we actually have like a family copy of Goldsmith's history that Austen read and actually wrote in the margins. And she was really, really giving it to Goldsmith. Like she was in conversation with him. Like he would write something and she would underline it, or she would put a note next to it and just be like, no. Or she even wrote like detestable monster next to Oliver Cromwell. Like she was not just reading and then turning the pages. She was like in there, really deep in that history. And it's so fascinating to know that about her before reading her own history of England. Not to mention that Oliver Goldsmith was actually also a fiction writer. So he wasn't just a historian, he was a fiction writer. And I think she was like kind of calling him out like, you can't be both. Or if you are both, then it's all fiction. So she was really having fun with digging into the very idea of that genre. Like, what is history? What is a historical text? And if it's just a story, then why can't she change the details herself? So I think this is why Austen's history, claims from the get-go, right, that I am partial and I am prejudiced, because she says that's what every historian is.
We believe that Jane wrote her notes in Goldsmith's volumes in early 1791, and then she wrote her History of England later in the year, dating the final copy to November, when she dedicated it to her sister Cassandra. What the History of England and the teenage writings at large tell us is that even at a young age, Jane was not a passive consumer. She read and read and read. What we heard from her brother Henry in the last episode was right. She read everything. And as she consumed novels and histories and poems and music, her brain was churning them into something new. She broke down their most basic essences. She internalized the rhythm and patterns of language and speech. She processed what worked and what didn't. And then she spilled those lessons back onto the page. In short, she was developing her craft. We also see her developing a style of critique. She laments the injustice of the execution of Mary Queen of Scots in the History of England. In Leslie Castle, she dissects the misplaced values of the social elite. In Love and Friendship, she recognizes the absurdity of exaggerated sensibility. Her social awareness grows keen, and her observations become more cutting, a signature feature of her later novels. Jane would continue to write throughout her adolescence, and this process of developing her craft would continue. It is something you can see in the first writings of adulthood, such as Lady Susan, which we'll soon discuss in a later episode. But it is also something you can see in her letters. Yes, her letters. Next time on Finding Jane Austen, we'll directly hear Jane's own thoughts and opinions, straight from the source, and find the truth behind her supposed first love affair. Thanks for listening to Finding Jane Austen. If you liked today's episode, please leave a review on your favorite podcast app. It helps us spread the love of Austen. Finding Jane Austen is a joint production of Revolutionary Histories and Primary Source Media. The series is researched and written by me, Dr. Ann Fertig. My executive producers are Jeanette Patrick and Jim Ambusky. Our thanks to our scholars Misty Kruger, Janine Barkas, and Jillian Dooley for their contributions to this episode. And to our voice actors, Emily Brady, Grace Mallon, and Adam Smith. Subscribe to Finding Jane Austen on your favorite podcast app. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.